Marcus Rodriguez never expected his morning jog to change everything. The former Navy SEAL had been living quietly in the small coastal town of Millbrook for 3 years now. His neighbors knew him as the guy who fixed boats at the marina and never talked much about his past. They had no idea that the quiet man with calloused hands had once been part of the most elite fighting force in the world. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Marcus laced up his running shoes and headed toward the beach path. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He loved these early hours when the world was still asleep, and his mind could find peace from the memories that haunted his nights. As he rounded the bend near the old lighthouse, Marcus noticed something unusual. A group of people had gathered near the town memorial park. Even from a distance, he could see they were military personnel. Their posture, their bearing, the way they stood at attention, these were details that someone like Marcus couldn't miss. His steps slowed as he approached. The group consisted of about 20 Navy SEALs in their dress uniforms. They stood in perfect formation, completely silent, facing a simple bench that sat beneath an old oak tree. Marcus had passed that bench hundreds of times during his runs. It was just a regular park bench with a small plaque he had never bothered to read. Something about the scene made his chest tighten. These weren't SEALs on official duty. There were no cameras, no crowd, no ceremony. They had simply appeared at dawn and taken their positions. The town was still sleeping, unaware of what was happening in their little memorial park. Marcus found himself moving closer, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. As he got near enough to read the plaque on the bench, his breath caught in his throat. The inscription was simple: in memory of Thomas Silent Tom Whitman, a soldier who never came home but never stopped serving. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Tom Whitman. Everyone in the SEAL community knew that name, though few knew the real story. Tom had been a legend, a SEAL who had served in the shadows for over 2 decades. But he had never received official recognition for his final mission. In fact, according to military records, Tom Whitman had never existed at all. Marcus watched as the SEALs maintained their vigil. No one spoke. No orders were given. They simply stood there in the morning light, paying tribute to a man the world would never officially acknowledge. As more townspeople began to wake up and start their day, they walked past the memorial without a second glance. They had no idea they were witnessing something extraordinary. The morning stretched on, and still the SEALs didn't move. Marcus realized he was witnessing something that went beyond military protocol or official ceremonies. This was personal. This was brotherhood. These men had come here on their own, without orders, without permission, to honor someone who had been forgotten by everyone, except those who truly understood what service meant. As Marcus stood there watching, memories of his own service began flooding back. The missions that couldn't be talked about, the sacrifices that went unrecognized, the brothers who had given everything and received nothing in return. He understood why these men had come. Some debts could only be paid by those who truly understood the cost. The sun climbed higher, and the town began to come alive around them. Still, the SEALs maintained their silent watch. Marcus realized this wasn't just about honoring Tom Whitman. This was about something much deeper, a code that existed beyond official recognition, beyond medals and ceremonies. This was about the promise that no one would be forgotten, even when the world chose to look away. Standing there in his running clothes, watching these elite warriors maintain their vigil, Marcus felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in years. It was a reminder of who he used to be, of the brotherhood he had left behind when he chose the quiet life of a small town. But some bonds, he was learning, could never truly be broken. The story of Tom Whitman was about to unfold in ways that would challenge everything Marcus thought he knew about heroism, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. As he stood there watching the silent tribute, he had no idea that he was about to become part of a legend that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone in the small town of Millbrook. Sarah Chen had been the mayor of Millbrook for 8 years, and she thought she had seen everything the small town could throw at her. Budget meetings, fishing disputes, the annual lobster festival planning. These were the kinds of challenges she was used to handling. But when her assistant called her at 7 in the morning about a group of military personnel gathering in the memorial park, she knew this was something different. By the time Sarah arrived at the park, A small crowd of curious townspeople had begun to form at a respectful distance. The SEALs remained motionless, their eyes fixed on the simple bench. Sarah approached the oldest SEAL, a man whose uniform bore the insignia of a Master Chief. His face was weathered, marked by years of service and experiences that most people could never imagine. "Excuse me," Sarah said quietly. "I'm the mayor. Is there something we can help you with?" Master Chief William Barnes turned slightly to acknowledge her, but didn't break his stance. "Ma'am, we're here to pay our respects. We won't be causing any trouble." Sarah looked around at the gathering crowd. "How long do you plan to stay?" "As long as it takes, ma'am." The simplicity of his answer left Sarah with more questions than answers. She noticed that Marcus Rodriguez had joined the crowd. Unlike the other townspeople who whispered among themselves, Marcus stood silently, his eyes fixed on the SEALs with an intensity that made Sarah wonder about his own story. As the morning progressed, something remarkable began to happen. Word spread quickly through the small town. But instead of complaints or concerns, people began to show support in their own quiet ways. Mrs. Patterson from the bakery brought coffee and donuts, setting them on a nearby table without saying a word. The local hardware store owner brought folding chairs for any SEAL who might need to rest, though none accepted the offer. Sarah found herself drawn into conversations with townspeople she had known for years, learning things about them she had never known. Old Mr. Henley, who ran the bait shop, quietly mentioned that he had served in Vietnam. Jenny Morrison, the librarian, revealed that her brother had been a Marine who died in Afghanistan. Slowly, Sarah began to understand that this silent tribute was touching something deep in the heart of their community. But it was when she overheard a conversation between two of the SEALs that Sarah began to grasp the true significance of what was happening. They spoke in low voices about Tom Whitman, sharing memories of a man who had apparently saved their lives on more than one occasion. According to their whispered stories, Tom had been the kind of SEAL who took on the missions that no one else could handle, the ones that were so classified that even their existence was denied. Marcus approached Sarah as she stood listening. "Mayor Chen," he said quietly, "I think there's something you should know about that bench." Sarah looked at him with curiosity. Marcus had always been polite but distant since moving to Millbrook. She had sensed there was more to his story than he let on, but she had never pressed. "I did some research this morning," Marcus continued. "Tom Whitman lived here in Millbrook for the last 5 years of his life. He was the old man who used to sit on that bench every morning feeding the birds. People thought he was just a lonely retiree. No one knew who he really was." Sarah's eyes widened as the pieces began to fall into place. She remembered the quiet old man who had appeared in town several years ago. He had rented a small apartment above the bookstore and spent his days walking around town, always polite but never really connecting with anyone. When he died 3 years ago, only a handful of people had attended his small funeral. But how did they know to come here? Sarah asked, gesturing toward the SEALs. Marcus was quiet for a moment before answering. "In the military, especially in units like the SEALs, you never really leave your brothers behind. Someone always knows where everyone is, even when they're trying to disappear. When Tom died, word spread through the network. It just took time for them to organize this." As if to confirm Marcus's words, more SEALs began arriving throughout the day. They came from different bases, different states, some even flew in from overseas deployments. None of them had been ordered to come. They simply appeared, took their place in the formation, and joined the silent vigil. The town of Millbrook found itself hosting something unprecedented. Local news crews tried to get interviews, but the SEALs refused to speak to reporters. Their silence only added to the mystery and power of their tribute. Social media posts about the gathering began to spread, but the SEALs remained focused on their purpose. Sarah spent the day moving between the townspeople and trying to understand what she was witnessing. She learned that this kind of tribute was rare even in military circles. The fact that so many SEALs had come, without orders, without official sanction, spoke to something extraordinary about the man they were honoring. As evening approached, Sarah realized that this was just the beginning. The SEALs showed no signs of leaving, and more were still arriving. Whatever Tom Whitman had done during his service, whatever sacrifice he had made, it had earned him a level of respect that transcended official recognition. The silent soldier had become a legend, and Millbrook had become the unexpected stage for a tribute that would change everyone who witnessed it. Dr. Emily Watson had been running the Millbrook Medical Clinic for 15 years, but she had never treated a patient quite like Thomas Whitman. He had walked into her clinic on a rainy Thursday afternoon 3 years ago, carrying an old military medical file that was so heavily redacted it looked like a classified document. Most of the pages were black with only scattered words visible: shrapnel, gunshot, surgery, and dates that spanned over 2 decades. Now, as she watched the growing number of SEALs maintaining their vigil at Tom's memorial bench, Emily found herself remembering details about her mysterious patient that she had never shared with anyone. Medical confidentiality had kept her silent, but the extraordinary tribute unfolding in her town made her reconsider what Tom would have wanted people to know. Tom had been different from her other patients. He never complained about pain, even though his x-rays showed evidence of multiple injuries that should have left him in constant discomfort. He had scars that told stories of violence and survival, yet he spoke to her with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone who had lived through such trauma. During one of his visits, Tom had asked her an unusual question. "Doc, if someone spent their whole life serving their country, but that service could never be acknowledged, would it still matter?" Emily had been struck by the sadness in his eyes when he asked. At the time, she had assumed he was another veteran struggling with the transition to civilian life. Now she understood that Tom had been carrying a much heavier burden than she could have imagined. As the second day of the vigil began, Emily decided to approach Master Chief Barnes. She found him during a brief moment when he had stepped away from the formation to coordinate with newly arriving SEALs. "Chief Barnes," she said quietly, "I was Tom's doctor. There are things about him that I think you should know." Barnes studied her carefully before nodding. "What can you tell me, Doc?" Emily chose her words carefully, balancing her professional obligations with her growing understanding of what Tom had meant to these men. He was in constant pain, but he never let it show. He had injuries that suggested he had been through things that most people couldn't survive. But what struck me most was how he talked about service. He believed that doing the right thing was its own reward, even if no one ever knew about it. Barnes was quiet for a long moment. "That sounds like Silent Tom. He always said that the best operations were the ones that never made the news." Emily learned from Barnes that Tom's nickname had come from his ability to complete missions, without leaving any trace of American involvement. He had spent 23 years carrying out operations that officially never happened. Governments had been toppled, terrorist plots had been stopped, and hostages had been rescued, all without Tom or his teams ever receiving recognition. "The thing about Tom," Barnes explained, "was that he volunteered for the missions that no one else wanted. The ones where success meant that America stayed safe, but failure meant that America would deny you ever existed. He understood that price, and he paid it willingly." As Emily listened, she began to understand why so many SEALs had come to honor Tom. He represented something that went beyond heroism. He embodied the ultimate sacrifice of serving without recognition, of accepting that his greatest achievements would never be acknowledged. Throughout the day, Emily found herself serving as an unofficial liaison between the townspeople and the SEALs. Her medical training had taught her to observe people carefully, and she could see that this vigil was affecting everyone involved in profound ways. Marcus Rodriguez had been spending more time at the memorial, and Emily noticed a change in him. The distant, guarded man she had known was beginning to show signs of the soldier he used to be. She suspected that Tom's story was awakening something in Marcus that he had tried to bury when he left the military. The townspeople, too, were being transformed by what they were witnessing. The baker had started bringing meals to the SEALs, refusing any payment. The local mechanic had offered to service any vehicles that needed maintenance. People who had never given much thought to military service were beginning to understand the weight of the sacrifices made on their behalf. Emily also noticed that the SEALs themselves were finding healing in their tribute. Many of them carried their own invisible wounds from years of service in the shadows. By honoring Tom, they were also honoring the parts of themselves that had never been recognized. As the third day of the vigil approached, Emily realized that Tom Whitman had achieved in death what he had never been able to claim in life: recognition for his service. But more than that, his story was bringing together a community and healing wounds that many didn't even know they carried. The silent soldier had found his voice, and it was speaking through the actions of those who refused to let his sacrifice be forgotten. Emily understood now that some forms of healing could only happen when people came together to honor something greater than themselves, and Tom's bench had become a place where that healing could begin. Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan had driven 12 hours straight from Norfolk Naval Base to reach Millbrook. He hadn't slept in 36 hours, and his dress uniform was wrinkled from the long journey, but none of that mattered when he saw Tom Whitman's memorial bench. Jake was one of the few people alive who knew the complete story of Tom's final mission, and he carried secrets that weighed heavier than any physical burden. Jake had been a young lieutenant when he first met Tom Whitman in Afghanistan. Tom was already a legend then, known for taking junior officers under his wing and teaching them lessons that weren't covered in any military manual. But it was Tom's last mission that had defined both their lives in ways that Jake was only now beginning to understand. The mission had been simple in concept, but impossible in execution. A group of American contractors had been taken hostage by a terrorist cell, operating in a region so remote and dangerous that conventional rescue operations were out of the question. The hostages included 2 engineers working on a water purification project and a doctor who had been providing medical care to local villages. Tom had volunteered to go in alone. The plan was for him to infiltrate the terrorist camp, assess the situation, and wait for backup. But intelligence suggested that the hostages would be executed within hours, long before any backup could arrive. Tom had made a decision that would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. As Jake stood among the other SEALs at the memorial, he remembered the last conversation he had with Tom over the radio. Tom had located the hostages but found the situation even more dangerous than anticipated. The terrorist cell was larger than expected, heavily armed, and paranoid about security. There was no way for Tom to extract the hostages safely. "I can get them out," Tom had radioed back to base, "but I'll need to create a diversion that will compromise my own extraction." Jake, serving as the mission coordinator, had been faced with an impossible choice. Following protocol meant waiting for backup and risking the lives of the hostages. Approving Tom's plan meant sending a good man to certain death. "Tom, negative on that plan," Jake had responded. "Wait for backup. That's an order." There had been a long silence on the radio before Tom's final transmission. "Sometimes orders can't cover every situation, Lieutenant. Some choices have to be made by the person on the ground." Tom had gone radio silent after that. 3 hours later, the hostages had walked out of the mountains alive and unharmed, found by a patrol of friendly forces who had been drawn to the area by explosions and gunfire. Tom Whitman was never seen again. The official report stated that the hostages had escaped during a firefight between rival terrorist factions. There was no mention of Tom Whitman or any American military operation. As far as the official record was concerned, Tom had simply disappeared during a routine reconnaissance mission. Jake had spent years carrying the guilt of that final radio exchange. Tom had asked for permission to sacrifice himself to save innocent lives, and Jake had denied that permission. Tom had disobeyed a direct order and saved 4 people, but in doing so, he had also saved Jake from having to live with the responsibility of ordering a man to his death. Now, as Jake looked around at the dozens of SEALs who had come to honor Tom, he realized that he wasn't the only one carrying secrets about the silent soldier. Other SEALs had their own stories, their own memories of times when Tom had made the hard choices that others couldn't make. Petty Officer Rodriguez, who had served with Tom in Iraq, spoke quietly about a mission where Tom had stayed behind to provide cover for an evacuation, holding off enemy forces single-handedly until his team could escape. Chief Warrant Officer Thompson remembered Tom volunteering for a deep cover mission that required him to live among suspected terrorists for 6 months, gathering intelligence that prevented multiple attacks on American soil. Each story revealed another piece of Tom's character. He had consistently chosen the most dangerous assignments, the ones that offered the least glory and the highest risk. He had spent his career making sacrifices that would never be acknowledged, taking on burdens that would have broken lesser men. Jake began to understand that Tom's vigil was about more than honoring one man's service. It was about acknowledging a type of heroism that society rarely recognized, the heroism of those who served in the shadows, who made sacrifices without expectation of reward, who chose duty over safety even when no one was watching. As the 4th day of the vigil continued, Jake noticed that the tribute was evolving. What had started as a simple gathering of SEALs had become something larger. Veterans from other branches of the military had begun arriving. Police officers, firefighters, and other first responders had joined the silent ranks. Even civilians who had never served in the military were finding ways to participate in the tribute. The memorial bench had become a symbol of something that transcended military service. It represented the idea that true heroism often went unrecognized, that the greatest sacrifices were often made by those who would never receive medals or parades. Jake realized that Tom Whitman had achieved something remarkable in death. His story was inspiring people to think differently about service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of heroism. The silent soldier had found a way to speak to the hearts of people he had never met, teaching lessons about duty and honor that would outlive any official recognition. Maria Santos had been working at the Millbrook post office for 27 years, and she prided herself on knowing every person who lived in the small town. But Thomas Whitman had always been an enigma to her. For the 5 years he lived above the bookstore, Tom had received mail like no one else she had ever seen. The letters came from all over the world, but they never had return addresses. They were always addressed simply to T. Whitman, with no military titles or formal designations. What struck Maria most was how Tom reacted when she handed him these mysterious letters. His hands would shake slightly and she could see pain flash across his eyes before he would quietly thank her and walk away. Now, watching the extraordinary tribute taking place at Tom's memorial bench, Maria finally understood what those letters had meant. As she spoke with the SEALs during her lunch break, she learned that they contained messages from people whose lives Tom had saved, people who couldn't officially acknowledge what he had done but who needed him to know that his sacrifices had mattered. Master, Chief Barnes showed Maria a letter that Tom had written but never sent. It had been found among his belongings after his death, addressed to the families of the 4 hostages he had rescued in his final mission. In the letter, Tom apologized for not being able to tell them what had really happened to their loved ones. He wrote that knowing they were safe and home with their families was all the recognition he needed. "Tom saved my son," said a voice behind Maria. She turned to see a woman in her 60s who had driven from Boston after seeing news coverage of the vigil. "My son David was one of the engineers taken hostage. When he came home, he told me about a guardian angel who had appeared out of nowhere and led them to safety. The official report said they escaped on their own, but David knew better. He spent years trying to find out who had saved him. The woman, who introduced herself as Carol Henderson, had brought photographs of her son's wedding, his children, and his successful engineering career. Tom never got to see what his sacrifice made possible," she said through tears. "My son has built bridges and water systems that have helped thousands of people. He named his daughter Hope because he said someone had given him hope when he thought he was going to die." Maria realized that Tom's story was much larger than any of them had imagined. Throughout the day, more people began arriving with their own connections to the silent soldier. A former ambassador spoke about a diplomatic crisis that had been quietly resolved through Tom's intervention. A terrorism expert from the FBI mentioned how Tom's intelligence work had prevented attacks that would have killed hundreds of innocent people. Each revelation added another layer to the mystery of Tom Whitman. He had been involved in operations that spanned decades and continents, yet he had lived his final years in complete anonymity in their small town. The man who had fed birds on the park bench every morning had been responsible for saving countless lives. Marcus Rodriguez finally broke his silence and shared his own connection to Tom. "I served with Tom in Syria," he told the gathered crowd. "There was a mission that went wrong and my entire unit was trapped behind enemy lines. Tom came in alone against orders and got us out. He could have been court-martialed for disobeying orders, but instead, the mission was classified so deep that it officially never happened." Marcus explained that when he left the military and came to Millbrook, he had been running from his memories of war. He had noticed the quiet old man who sat on the park bench, but had never recognized him as the legendary SEAL who had saved his life. Tom was dealing with his own demons, but he never let them make him bitter or angry. He chose to find peace in the simple things, feeding birds, walking around town, being kind to people who didn't know who he was. As the 5th day of the vigil continued, Maria began to see how Tom's story was changing everyone who heard it. The SEALs who had come to honor him were finding their own healing in the process. The townspeople were discovering a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices made by those who served in the shadows. Even the visitors who had traveled from far away were being transformed by witnessing this unprecedented tribute. The local news coverage had evolved from simple reporting to deeper reflection on the nature of heroism and service. National media outlets were beginning to pick up the story, though the SEALs continued to refuse interviews. Their silence had become part of the tribute's power. They were honoring Tom in the same way he had served, without seeking attention or recognition. Maria realized that Tom Whitman had taught them all a profound lesson about the true meaning of service. He had shown that the greatest heroes were often those who worked in darkness, so that others could live in light. His legacy wasn't measured in medals or commendations, but in the lives he had saved and the example he had set. The silent soldier had become a teacher, and his classroom was a simple park bench where hundreds of people were learning about sacrifice, honor, and the quiet courage that exists when no one is watching. 7 days after the vigil began, the town of Millbrook had been forever changed. What had started as a handful of SEALs paying their respects had grown into something that defied easy description. Hundreds of military personnel, veterans, first responders, and civilians had joined the tribute to Tom Whitman. The simple park bench had become a symbol of recognition for all those who served without seeking glory. On the final morning of the vigil, Master Chief Barnes made the first public statement since the tribute had begun. Standing before the memorial bench with his fellow SEALs arrayed behind him, he spoke with a voice that carried the weight of decades of service. Thomas Whitman never sought recognition for his service, Barnes said. He understood that some sacrifices are their own reward. But we want the world to know that his service mattered. Every life he saved, every threat he eliminated, every mission he completed in the shadows, it all mattered. Barnes explained that the SEALs had come not because they were ordered to, but because they knew that some debts could only be paid by those who understood their true cost. Tom taught us that honor isn't about what others think of you. It's about what you're willing to do when no one is watching. It's about choosing to serve something greater than yourself, even when that service will never be acknowledged. The ceremony that followed was unlike any military tribute that Millbrook had ever witnessed. Instead of formal speeches and official protocols, it was marked by personal testimonies and quiet reflection. Veterans shared stories of their own invisible sacrifices. Civilians spoke about the service members in their own families who had carried burdens that could never be fully shared. Marcus Rodriguez finally stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "I came to this town 3 years ago trying to escape my memories of war," he said. "I thought that leaving the military meant leaving behind the brotherhood and the purpose that had defined my life. But watching this tribute has reminded me that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform." Tom understood that. He spent his final years serving this community in quiet ways, just like he had served his country. Marcus announced that he was establishing the Thomas Whitman Foundation, dedicated to supporting veterans who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. Tom showed us that you can find new ways to serve, new ways to make a difference. His legacy isn't just about what he did in the military. It's about how he chose to live after his service was officially over. Dr. Emily Watson spoke about the healing she had witnessed over the past week. "Tom's story has brought people together in ways that I never thought possible. Veterans who had been isolated have found community. Civilians who never understood military sacrifice have gained new appreciation for what service means. His bench has become a place where people can come to remember that heroism takes many forms." Mayor Sarah Shen announced that the town council had voted unanimously to establish a permanent memorial to Tom Whitman and all those who serve in the shadows. The simple bench would be expanded into a memorial garden where people could come to reflect on service and sacrifice. "Tom chose our town as his final home," she said. "We're honored to be the guardians of his memory." As the formal ceremony concluded, the SEALs began their final tribute. One by one, they approached Tom's bench and left behind items that symbolized their connection to the silent soldier. Some left challenge coins, others left photographs, and many left handwritten notes expressing gratitude for lessons learned and lives saved. The townspeople joined in this final act of remembrance. Children who had learned about Tom's story from their parents left drawings and flowers. Local business owners left tokens of appreciation for the sacrifices made on their behalf. Veterans from other conflicts left their own mementos, creating a growing collection of tribute items that represented decades of service and sacrifice. As the sun set on the seventh day, the formal vigil came to an end. But the SEAL's departure didn't mark the end of Tom's story. It marked the beginning of its next chapter. The memorial bench had become a pilgrimage site for military personnel and civilians alike. People from around the country began making the journey to Millbrook to pay their respects to the silent soldier and to reflect on their own understanding of service. Tom Whitman had achieved in death what he had never sought in life, lasting recognition for his service. But more importantly, his story had become a catalyst for conversations about the true meaning of heroism, the weight of invisible sacrifices, and the importance of honoring those who serve without seeking glory. The myth of the silent soldier had become a reality that would inspire future generations. In a world that often celebrated the loud and the visible, Tom's story reminded people that the greatest heroes were often those who worked in silence, who made sacrifices without expectation of reward, and who understood that true service was its own recognition. The SEALs had stood in honor without orders, without unit designation. Because some tributes transcend military protocol, they had reminded the world that brotherhood, sacrifice, and honor are not bound by official recognition. In doing so, they had ensured that the silent soldier would never truly be silent again,